Hi everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the fifth of our roundtables. My name is Doug. I'm one of the co-founders of Intelligent People. And if you don't know us, we're a specialist product recruiter with close to 20 years experience recruiting product talent up to board level. We provide both permanent and interim services, contingency and executive search, including product ops, product design and product management up to CPO level. Please go to our website to see any current live roles. We also have a leading product mentorship scheme called Partner Up with over 215 mentors, and we've had over 1,200 mentee requests. Again, please do see our website for details. Today's roundtable is product leaders, how to influence the CEO and board. Our guest speakers are Lucy Stonehill. Lucy is the founder and executive chair of BridgeU. And Lucy will cover understanding board dynamics and give a perspective from the CEO's point of view. We have Ankur Sharma. Ankur is the CPO and CTO of Perkbox. And from a product leader's perspective, how to ensure strategic alignment between product, CEO and board. And our third speaker is Kevin Linderman. Kevin is the product director for AI commercial and growth at Klarna. And Kevin will cover effective communication and influencing strategies. So if we move on to the first section, there should be a graphic coming up quite shortly. Lucy Stonehill will be covering understanding the CEO and board dynamics. Lucy is a CEO formerly, and founder of BridgeU, a leading ed tech scale-up. And we have on the graphic here the 8 types of CEO: commercial executor, financial value driver, the corporate ambassador, corporate entrepreneur, the people's champion, the global missionary, the conscious capitalist, and the innovative inventor. Lucy, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself and give a quick overview, and we can start things off.
I'd love to. Thank you so much for having me, Doug. It's a real pleasure to be here. So you're absolutely right. I stepped down from my CEO position 2 months ago, I should say. So I have much more experience being a CEO than not in my professional career. But maybe what I'll do is I'll give a bit of background into myself, my 10-year experience founding and running BridgeU, and then I'll maybe just comment, Doug, on a few of those CEO prototypes to give a personal flavor with the prototypes that I feel most aligned to my background and experience. So a bit about me. I am a third culture kid at heart. I grew up moving between the US and UK. You're absolutely right, Doug. In 2014, I founded BridgeU, which has become the leading university and careers guidance provider, connecting international K-12 schools in 147 countries now to higher education institutions around the world. The mission at BridgeU has remained very stable, although the business has grown significantly. The goal really with BridgeU was always to connect global talent, global students with the best higher education opportunities available to them, and to help K-12 high schools and universities alike to leverage digital solutions to enable global student mobility. In 2020, after 7 years, in fact, of running BridgeU and raising venture capital, the business was acquired by Kaplan, one of the world's largest and most diversified education providers. And from 2020 to 2024, I was part of the Kaplan global leadership team. So I guess in summary, throughout my career, I've raised $50 million in institutional and strategic capital, and seen many different versions of product management leaders, through to the company now has a fantastic VP of product, which Doug, you helped introduce us to. And as Doug mentioned, I'm currently executive chair of the company, and I sit on a number of different companies advising and supporting different, both larger scale universities, as well as I'm a venture partner at Emerge Education, which is a European seed fund. So I guess looking at the infographic you brought up there, Doug, it was interesting. I hadn't seen it before, and I spent a bit of time just reflecting on how I think most CEOs are probably a bit of a blend. Certainly, I think I'm probably the strongest prototype I relate to as being a commercial operator. So I was the type of CEO, probably I'm still very much the type of person who's very motivated by winning, very commercial, very oriented around growth and expansion, signing new clients, booking revenue. And of course, seeing fantastic products grow and winning features achieve the desired impact within my organization. I guess from a product perspective, I think one of the challenges of a commercial sort of operator, CEO, is that, certainly I think early on in BridgeU's evolution, I wasn't as focused in on ensuring the product met the needs of our clients and users. I was always probably slightly selling ahead, and I'm sure a number of people on the call are used to spending time with CEOs like that. But again, you have a chicken and egg problem at the beginning of any company, where you need clients and users in order to test the product, to figure out how the product serves the needs or not of your user base. And so sometimes you do need to sell ahead, I think, in order to get ahead and start to really inform that roadmap. And then I think probably also have elements of the corporate ambassador and global missionary. So it's an interesting one. And I think you're right, Doug, to bring that up, because probably, and I'm sure Kevin and Ankur talk about this, you probably need to engage CEOs quite differently depending on their background and their leanings. And I think the infographic brought up was quite a good one.
Yeah, and again, you've been interestingly part of a really rapidly growing scale up, but also a sort of a larger corporate.
Absolutely.
And do you give it? You're here to give everybody the perspective of what does the CEO want? Like how do we manage this person upwards? So are there changes in what you look for from the scale up side to being on Kaplan? Can you sort of talk us through those different dynamics? And
yeah, absolutely. And happily, I'll talk a little bit, maybe, Doug, to the sort of various, perhaps the three sort of maybe major stages of the company's evolution as it relates to the role of the CEO, but also the role of the board and the dynamics of that board in terms of how it forms. So I think the very early stage startup, the sort of concept to early kind of customer, what we might call pre-seed to seed. Naturally, that should be a very casual, informal board structure. You largely have the founders at that point. You maybe have a handful of early employees, but I really think that if there is in fact a board at that stage, it's an opportunity to start to set a discipline around reporting and coming up with some sort of North Star metrics for the business. But early stage startups are so unpredictable, as you know, Doug, that I think the board should not be there to kind of hold the team to accountability. It really should be there to support the founding team and to focus in on strategy and priorities, particularly given the limited resources of those kind of companies at that stage. I think then you're absolutely right. Then you sort of maybe you get into more series, what we might in the venture world call Series A, Series B territory, and that's probably more of a scale-up board. In my experience, and again, I can only speak from my experience, there's obviously lots of different trajectories that companies can take. But in my experience, scale-up boards are very focused in on expansion and growth. Yeah. Setting strategy, priorities at the board level that then kind of cascade down the business. Brainstorming important problem areas with the board, setting annual objectives, and importantly, as it relates to product talent, I think, and product leadership, really starting to invest in your first kind of functional key leaders and the emergence of a leadership team. So, I think what changes in a scale-up board compared to a very early stage board is reporting and accountability starts to become more important, hitting the plan. As does balanced representation on the board. When we were at that sort of scale-up stage, or the beginning of that scale-up stage, I will say, we started to introduce kind of deep dives every quarter. And that was really, Doug, when we started to introduce our product and engineering leadership to the board to present and offer, much more detailed deep dive view on how, in particular, the product function was steering the resources, the meaningful resources that we'd allocated to product design engineering, and in our case, data engineering and data science. So, I personally thought this was a fantastic opportunity to put, the right product leadership in front of the board. It gives the product leader an opportunity to really, represent what goes on in effectively the R&D function of the business, and critically, and I'm sure again Ankur and Kevin will come into this, it gives that individual or product and engineering leadership duo an opportunity to connect the dots between the company strategy and the investment that you're allocating with the product strategy and how that's then cascading through the engineering team. And then you're right, Doug. I mean, in the last sort of 4 years of BridgeU, we've had a fantastic opportunity with a wonderful parent company in Kaplan to see, a different kind of board dynamic where, we probably were more focused or have been more focused in on what I might call a path to profitability board and board dynamic. And that, of course, then, growth and expansion is still important, but I have found that the orientation of the board tends to focus much more around unit economics and a path to profitability. And, therefore you tend to focus in on, things like, what is the revenue that an individual salesperson is bringing into the business, and what's the ratio of that revenue book to their on target sort of earning capacity. And I think that's also when, for the first time, we started having conversations with our board about the fully loaded cost, for example, of shipping a feature and the efficiency of the product and engineering function. So again, I think that's more of a board dynamic where growth and efficiency become more of a balancing act.
Yeah, and so BridgeU was kind of your brainchild. Did you have a product background before? And because what I'm driving at here is, do you think a product leader should take a different approach to a CEO who has a product background to one who doesn't? And if so, kind of how, why, what would you advise there?
I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I did not have, I didn't, I was 25 when I started the company, so I didn't have much of a background in anything really. I think by default, Doug, in the very early stages, excuse me, I think in the very early stages of a company, the product vision, if you will, is always led by the founder. Founders. So, that I think and some of that comes out of an individual, a founder in my case, who's cared deeply about the problem space and invested a lot of time and energy, frankly, in what I didn't even know was good product practice at the time, but was spending a lot of time with prospective customers and deeply understanding their pain points, writing that down, coming back to the very small group of engineers we had at the time and really describing those, again, what I now understand to be user stories to the engineering team. But I think in those very, very early days, I think it's a healthy thing, an important thing, in fact, for founders and CEOs to get close, to be intimately familiar with the customer and the user needs. I think when, my own experience is once you start to sort of onboard a few early customers, there's a very big difference. I don't need to say this to you or the audience on this call, but there's a very big difference between understanding how to talk about and design a solution in concept versus putting something in front of users and seeing how they fundamentally engage with it. And I think that's really when we started to look at bringing in that early kind of product talent. At the time, we couldn't afford a product leader, right? So it was product managers to begin with, one and then two, and then you grow from there. But I think the importance of that was building on the early stage understanding that I had, deep understanding for the problem space, but building some craft around how does that understanding translate into a roadmap and fundamentally a structured program of improvements that we can start to make to the early version of the product.
Yeah, and that's kind of around when you get the sort of the product market fit, isn't it? You've got some tech and some ideas, and you've kind of moved them all together and thought, okay, we can build something here, and hey, it's got kind of legs. So what about in terms of building trust then? Because I talk to a lot of CPOs and a lot of senior product people, and it's all about stakeholder management. Internal stakeholder management is really, really important. It's a massive subject. So how can people build trust and I guess credibility with someone like you at the various stages, at your sort of product market fit sort of stage, at your scale stage, and then at the sort of the corporate and the unit metrics stage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think my view on this has evolved. I think, my most recent, viewpoint on this, and this is certainly something I've communicated to product leaders in recent years at BridgeU, is I actually think product leaders and product managers have more in common with the CEO role than one might think. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why I think that's the case. The CEO is fundamentally responsible for setting strategy and the allocation of resources across, the entirety of the company. The product manager or the product leader is responsible for setting the product vision, the direction, the strategy for how the product will evolve, and for critically building objectives and a view of how resource should be aligned to those different product objectives. That's time spent on building out certain features. That's, dedicated engineering squads across the entirety of that roadmap. And I think, again, the product manager and the product leader is actually responsible for the deployment of a very meaningful percentage of resource allocation. They fundamentally direct the efforts of, again, in our case, the engineering function, the design function, and in some cases, certainly in ours, data engineering and data science. So, that's a pretty tall order, setting the strategy and deploying the resources. And obviously there's a fair amount of pressure then on the outcomes that you're generating as a result. And I think product managers and product leaders should, take the view that CEOs have a similar challenge and level of responsibility, and they can perhaps bond on that. I think the other thing now that I've seen over the years in particular, and certainly as the business has grown and there's been more people and kind of more complexity and scale to the organization, I think, a good CEO needs to be great at communication. And I think that's across levels, right? So communicating an inspiring vision, communicating a plan for the annual strategy, being able to communicate objectives and key results, even down to, in a board dynamic, being able to defend specific KPIs. So I think the same is also true of product leaders, right? He or she needs to be able to establish a compelling long-term product vision that gets the buy-in of the product engineering design team, but also the whole company. And I think out of that should fall a product strategy, a quarterly roadmap, user stories, etc. So I think in many ways, I was really looking for product leaders who could communicate across that vast spectrum, right? I needed to feel that they had an ability to inspire and create a narrative that manifested itself as a long-term product vision to win the buy-in of the individuals they were needing to work with closely, as well as the whole company. And at the same time, someone who could demonstrate to me that they had not just the sort of creativity and the narrative skills to tell a good story, but ultimately had enough of a structure and a product craft and a discipline to bring the approach and the responsibility of frankly, a pretty meaningful share of the company's annual resources and put that to good use, such that I could really see that actually they also could excel in execution. Which is ultimately how you drive the outcomes at the product level that's needed. So I guess those are sort of, I guess, cut some of my thoughts on that front.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of chat in the product community about product managers, etc., being the CEOs of their own product because they run their own P&L, etc. for it. And actually, at a more senior level, in some of the CPO chat groups I'm in, there's a lot of chat about, okay, I'm a CPO. How do I get to become a CEO? Like what are the steps? Yeah, because traditionally CEOs have been entrepreneurs like yourself who had an idea and kind of made it happen. But in more corporates, if you look at I don't know, Siebel and whatever, they're people who've come through a sales rank or a finance rank. And product's sort of a relatively new function in as much as it's been going 20 years. So lots of the people who climb the ranks, they're now thinking, well, what, the next step on the ladder for me is a CEO. How I guess just you've been a CEO. If you were a CPO, are there any tips you would, or if you were talking to CPOs, are there tips you would give them as to how to get from, how to change the P to an E sort of thing?
Interesting. I mean, I guess there's a couple of things. I think and I've employed and worked with a broad spectrum in terms of business or commercial mindedness, Doug. But I certainly think if there was a chance for, if there was a transition point for a CPO to a CEO, I think they would need to demonstrate that they deeply understand how to connect and link the company strategy and ultimately the revenue plan to product and engineering execution. And I think at least in my experience, I've met product managers and product leaders who are quite purist about their craft and about the needs of the user and protecting the user. And inevitably, sometimes that can come into conflict with the needs of the business. And in fact, sometimes the needs of the customer is different from the needs of the user, and the customer is ultimately paying. So I think, product leaders or CPOs who demonstrate a really an ability and a willingness to make decisions based on driving revenue, I think is probably a much closer to the CEO role than not. And then I think, really simply, Doug, I think, one of the things that I think is true of the CEO role and true of the CPO role is, there's no replacement for spending quality time with other leaders in the business. And I think, that you were right to point out that it's probably across my leadership team, the two roles that need to spend as much time as possible with other leaders are the CEO and the CPO, or the VP of product in our case. And there's no replacement for building strong relationships, building trust, across the leadership team, even with the sort of functional leaders below. Because I think a product leader like a CEO really benefits from having a broad spectrum of perspectives, but also fundamentally winning the trust of those with whom he or she is working closely day in, day out.
That's really, really good. That's incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. So
thank you very much for having me.
That's okay. I think we have Ankur next. So Lucy, just the perspective as CEO, not only from sort of seed company through to scale up, through to being on a corporate board, has been absolutely invaluable. I'd really like to thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's been a pleasure.
No problem. So I think we have Ankur coming through next. Now, Ankur's going to be discussing from a product leader's perspective how to ensure strategic alignment between the product, the CEO and board. And again, we should be getting a graphic coming on the screen shortly, which is talking about the importance of strategic alignment. There's some quick stats there. So the level of strategic alignment of an organization explains up to 80% of the difference in performance between organizations. Work that is effectively aligned to strategy is 57% more likely to deliver a business benefit, is 50% more likely to finish on time, and really importantly is 45% more likely to stay within budget. Ankur is the CTO and CPO of Perkbox. Hi, Ankur. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Doug, for having me. Thank you, everyone, for joining the live stream and the roundtable. I really loved listening to Lucy. I have worked with quite a few commercial operator CEO, as she said, the dominant part of her CEO profile. And I love working with them because they love winning, and it just raises the momentum through and through across the organization. I also love the model of which she kind of propounded, which is first sell and then build. But that's not for everyone, so I'll keep it for another day.
Indeed. Would you like to give us a quick introduction before we, a quick positive history of yourself? And
absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Ankur. I am a Chief Product and Technology Officer at Perkbox, where I lead an organization of product design, engineering, and data. We have recently been acquired by a private equity, and now we are merged with VivUp, an employee benefits organization. This will now help us serve 4 million employees across 7,500 organizations. I have been leading product and engineering teams with P&L responsibility for almost 20 years now, with startup to large enterprise, publicly listed company, and everything in between. I've worked with multiple sectors like travel, marketplaces, real estate, media, and now in employee experience. I've worked in different ownership type, led global teams, and now been part of a couple of exits now. So multiple sectors, multiple ownership type, multiple platforms, B2B, B2C, and I've led global teams. So and really privileged to be here with speaking with you.
Yeah, and interestingly, you've been with some, and we're delighted to have you because you've been with some businesses that have had to pivot as well due to economic circumstances. And that's all about alignment with product vision and the business goals. So could you maybe just give us your thoughts on this? How to align the product vision with the business goals? What happens if there's a pivot or something changes?
So, before I deep dive into this, I just want to, kind of link up with what Lucy was saying. One of the thing and this has happened with me in my life, as you move from being a product manager, from being a manager of a manager, to being in a C-suite and being a product leader, one of the new paradigms which you have to start adjusting to, and really fast, that you now have to start empathizing not just with the customer and users and to your stakeholder, which is your peers, is you also have to start empathizing very deeply and dearly to your shareholders and investors, which are represented by your company board and by your CEO. That is an aspect which is always at the back of your mind as a product manager, as a manager of a manager, but it kind of gets exposed really openly to you as soon as you step into a C-suite role, as soon as you become a product leader. And all of a sudden you start realizing that actually you are not delivering just for customers, just for your stakeholders, but for your shareholders, but for your investors, and for your customers, and for your stakeholders. So perhaps the part one of aligning this product vision with business goal is to understand what are the business goals, and are they changing as the time changes, like you rightly said, right? And do they need to change as the market or the winds are changing? And we have seen how it has happened in last 5 years, 4 to 5 years. Sometimes it's because of COVID, because of cost of living crisis, and how can product feed into it? At the end of the day, it needs to feel like a two-way conversation. uh, it may sound very obvious when I'm saying this, but I've seen leaders who have not been really oblivious to the changes, but they wait for it to be communicated, top down. They and that I believe that's where, as a product leaders, we kind of fail ourselves, and the organization. Um, Now, I also feel as product leader, we are in a privileged position that we get to speak to the customers, to the users, to the people who are closest to the problems. So we are in a privileged position to actually read the metaphorical tea leaves. We can communicate, and we do not use that position often enough to go back to the board, communicate back to the board, and say, hey, you know what? We have this position and we are very good at pattern matching the problems which we anticipate are coming. So we should pivot. We should change our positioning, change our org strategy, and using that, we should change our product vision, change our product strategy. So yeah, so we should be open, be extremely transparent about with absorbing the business goal, translating into product vision, and be ready to pivot as the organization changes their goals. Yeah, I would even say that we should be perhaps the first one to raise an alarm when we see that business goal do not match the reality of the market.
I was going to say, actually, because there's two things there. It must be quite difficult if you've got a product vision and it's all aligned, and then somebody just says, hey, the business goals changed, and you've got to stand this on your head. So how do you stay detached on something like that? How do you not get sort of married to the product, maybe. I don't know if that's the right expression. I'd love to hear anything you could say about that. And also, have there been occasions when you've read those tea leaves and thought, this isn't going to fly, like the business need has changed, and you've had to be the one to sort of take that to the board and say, we have to change here?
Yeah. So happens a couple of times before in my life. There are times when I've been heard. There are times when I have not been heard, and that's perfectly fine, as long as you are doing your ethical duty to the organization to make sure that you when you see something wrong, you go back and make sure that you speak to the right people in the organization. There are various tools which you can use in the plan. For instance, one of the tool which at least we use, at least I use, is as simple as a roadmap. So we derive our roadmap from the product strategy, but we also have a guiding principle which I keep on banging about, is that in the roadmap we have priorities, but priorities are not set in stone. If the new data points emerge, we should be ready to change the priorities, because if we will not change the priorities, somebody else will come in and eat up our business. As simple as that. So yes, people want predictability using that roadmap, and we should give them as much as possible. We should have a very clear strategic product roadmap, which should align, which should define how this product strategy would be achieved over the period of time. But we should continue to keep reviewing that roadmap, and if need be, we should be ready to review our priorities. An example could be as simple as that, hey, you know what, if the churn of an organization is bad, we shouldn't be continue to keep building features or initiatives for growth because we had prioritized them 3 months back or 6 months back, right? That is a very good opportunity to go back, relook at the roadmap and say, you know what, the idea is, or the key is to actually save churn, to save customers at this point in time, and not just continue to keep building for growth. Cross-functional collaboration is another tool, which is such a massive armory in the product leaders repertoire. They do not use very often. They use very often, but the key is, how do you further the organization goal and not just the product goal, right? How do you actually use the cross-functional collaboration with a unified messaging that can be repeated over and over again? How do you work closely with the marketing, sales, engineering, customer support to ensure that the strategy which you have is very well understood and supported across the organization? You need to make sure that apart from the strategy, the messaging is kind of crystallized into a one-liner that everybody can kind of sign up for. And if that changes over the period of time, everybody can easily adopt that as well, right? Then there's a voice of customer. Do we have across the organization a one way to measure the voice of customer? It could be in the form of NPS. It could be in the form of quantitative matrices like the conversion rate or the retention, which is being tracked across the company. Is it being transparently communicated across the organization? Do people know how to read it, right, and actually get the right messaging out of it? These are the things which we kind of double down upon and try to transparently communicate across the organization. There are other things also which Lucy kind of alluded to, which is, how do you efficiently allocate the resources? How do you make sure you link your matrices and KPI to not just a success of a product, but then eventually the success of the product is also, how does the success looks like in the product is linked to the revenue goals, right? If you are launching a product, are you preemptively defining what the success looks like? And is it related to not just an outcome, but also to something which is an organization goal? And the goal could be dependent on where the organization is at that point in time. It could be increasing EBITDA,
Yeah.
reducing the churn, or driving more growth.
Okay. And are there any? I mean, you've said there's been a couple of times when your voice has been heard and when it hasn't. What are the risks of misalignment then, would you say? And are there any examples you can share of where there's, some sort of scars of where there's been a misalignment for whatever reason?
Yeah. So there's a interesting term which is I don't know if I should call it a management term, but there's a term called strategic drift, wherein if there's a strategic misalignment between how the organization is going versus what we are building for our customers, the company may drift away from their core competency, right? And that in turn may weaken their strategic positioning, uh,
Okay.
which can make it vulnerable, which can make the company vulnerable to the external threats. And we have seen that over and over again, happening to really large companies who think that um, they are immune to any kind of external threat because they are just too big to fail, right? There have been books written about it in the form of Innovator's Dilemma and so on and so forth. But uh, a lot of times, uh, strategic drift happens largely because there's a strategic misalignment.
Mm,
Um, when people either want to optimize for growth, but there's a massive churn happening in the organization at that point in time, and hence they kind of drift away from their core competency, um, and 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 hence squander away their core competency to perhaps to an incumbent or to a new player in the market. I've seen that happen at least a couple of times in my career. There's clearly a lack of direction internally, which uh, you know which is a risk which get induced with a strategic misalignment. Internally the team's morale can go down,
mm,
productivity can go down, engagement can go down. People often end up saying, hey, you know what, this quarter we were doing X thing, why are we doing Y thing over the next quarter, and so on and so forth. The time to market can get delayed, uh, in a space where your biggest moat is the speed of execution. uh,
mm,
Strategy misalignment can cause delay in product development and launch, your go to market. And that's where again a new player can take the size of the pie from you in the market. Your brand can be damaged, right? Because stakeholders can actually stakehold, and in this case your stakeholder could be the partners or merchants you're working with, right? They can start having second thoughts about working with you, because you can have an inconsistent or a poorly executed strategy. You might, for instance, be building a channel partner strategy which you might have not completely thought through.
mm.
Um, so yeah, there could be multiple things which would be happening, but one of the biggest challenges this strategic drift, wherein you have a core competency and you can easily squander it to a new player.
Yeah. Do you think much of that is down to because I think of the banks, for example.
Yeah.
No, they're not tech organisations, but I think they've just become complacent and they feel they've got a monopoly, and and as a result, we've now got innovators. You've got TransferWise who found out ways to get around regulations to transfer money low cost, and the banking sector is kind of being stood on its head, the retail banking as a result. Do you think much of this misalignment or strategic drift is due to, I guess, that kind of self-serving attitude on the board and complacency, or is that just the nature? Is it in the nature of tech to just disrupt and new people come in and the old guard goes out?
So I won't be surprised if somebody at Barclays or Lloyd would have come in and said, it might not be the product team, it might be someone in the marketing team would have said, long before Wise would have come in and said, hey, you know what, there's a better way, or there's a faster way, or there's a cheaper way to transfer money.
Yeah.
Right. But what you need to understand is this is a cash cow for Barclays and Lloyd. They don't want to squander this, right, at a board level, at a CEO level. For somebody like Wise, this is not a cash cow. This is a customer acquisition strategy. So and that's where the whole dilemma comes in. For Barclays or Lloyd does not want to squander this, while Wise can come in and say, hey, you know what, I will do this, and this is a missed opportunity for traditional bank vis-a-vis somebody who can eat, who is now eating basically market share of the of these traditional banks. So I won't be surprised if somebody in the traditional banking company would have gone to the board and said, hey, you know what, why don't we do this, long before even Wise had come in.
Okay. Yeah. It's just complacency then, and that the status quo is good for us. So I guess it's taken the eye off the customer, which is where it should be. Yeah.
I mean, complacency is a strong word. It's at that point in time, the cash on the table is just too much to let go of. If you see companies who actually end up innovating over and over again are ready to kill their own cash cows. Gillette is a great example. Apple is a great example. They basically end up killing their own cash cows. But that is the only way to survive in an ever evolving market.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you for that, Ankur. I think we've probably got to move to Kevin next, but thank you so much for your take on that. I like the fact of killing your own cash cow, because that takes bravery. So thanks for your time. Next up, that's fine. Next up, we have Kevin Linderman from Klarna. Kevin, we should again get a graphic on the screen shortly, but Kevin's going to be talking about influencing styles, so effective communication and influencing techniques. And we've got some influencing styles here: the persuader, the inspirer, the collaborator, the consulter, the appealer, the messenger, the legitimizer, and the dominator as well. So, Kevin, thanks so much for your time today. If you would be perhaps kind enough to give us a quick introduction.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Doug. Just to reflect on that diagram, it's like a combination of pretty much all of them. But we'll get into that. We'll talk about it. So hello all. Wonderful. Thank you for joining. Wonderful to be here. I accidentally fell into product 20 years ago. I hate saying that, not because I regret being in product, because it reminds me of my age. It happened while studying in university. Haven't looked back at all. Spent about half that time in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, the other half in London, mostly in seed through Series C startups. And then a surprise happened, which is the company I was working at was acquired by Klarna, which has honestly been such a pleasure and such a phenomenal journey in terms of how we operate and how I've been able to leverage my skills and background. So since being part of a larger organization, have integrated multiple startups into the business, and am now focused on AI and all kinds of really, really cool efficiencies, leveraging the coolest new thing on the street. I just reflecting on some of what Lucy said, but this also ties into some of what Ankur said. I am totally commercially obsessed. I think the role of product leadership is obligatory when it comes to growth, obligatory when it comes to bottom line revenue and everything associated in between. So using the product skill to solve legitimate problems that support company growth, genuinely my ethos and what I'm all about. So yeah, I'll stop there, Doug, if you wanted to tee anything up before I jump into any other topics.
No, keep on. It's great.
Cool. So I think kind of reflecting on this conversation, I'm not going to tease out any specific points, but it's like what has worked for me and what hasn't worked for me is something I'd really like to talk about. I think there's two key components to when it comes to influencing a CEO. You never know what kind of CEO you're going to get. And I say that without judgment. Everyone's different. You never know what kind of CPO you're going to get. So I can say it about myself at the same time. It's the role of product leadership to adapt. It's the role of product leadership to find a way to make that work. That is part of the job spec, in my opinion. So there's two key components. There's the relationship side of it, and there's the credibility side of it, which are two things that I'm super, super passionate about. So what does it mean to develop a relationship? It's a really easy term, but it means that we may at times have to go outside of our comfort zone. We may at times have to style flex in terms of the type of person that we are and the type of CEO that is ultimately holding that product strategy and vision that is driving the company that we're not up to speed on if we've joined 2 years on. There's 2 years before it, that foundational sort of aspect that we're not going to get. So how do we ramp up? It's really about finding a way to reach common footing with that CEO, regardless of the type of individual they are, regardless of the type of CEO that they are. It's taking the time to do that. I say it having not done it. I've messed this up previously, and I don't mess it up now. I've not messed it up in a really long time, but I say it having done it and learned it and reflected. And of course, at the time, as I mean, so many of us maybe do, but I certainly did. I was like, no, I was right. Like, I was totally right. And now I look back and I'm like, no, I wasn't. I mean, maybe I was a little bit right, but I wasn't totally right. So I think that adaptation and finding that common ground is absolutely critical, because that is where the strategy, vision, and direction of the company comes from. And I actually don't really care where the CEO comes from. They can have a product background, they can have a finance background, they can have a sales background. It doesn't make a difference, because as a CPO, I'm not the CEO. So with that being said, putting that time into, I don't want to say only the personal relationship. It's not about like going out to the pub. It's not about going to dinner either. It's just about finding a way to work together, finding a way to where your two styles converge in a productive way that drives the product story forward. But that's one piece of it. And it's a critical piece, but it's not the only one. There's one that's equally critical, which is the credibility side of it. So what makes you a credible product leader versus a non-credible product leader? Yeah, you know the craft. Yeah, you know how to deliver. Yeah, you know how to develop a roadmap. Those are all standard. I expect those all day long. It was a point Lucy raised. How do you bridge that to the rest of the business? That's really, really important. But there's an even bigger one, which is, are you a product leader living and breathing the problem in which you're solving? If you're not passionate about the product that you're a product leader for, it's up to you if that's a right fit for you. Sometimes we take a role because we have to. Sometimes we take a role because we absolutely want to, and it's our passion project. And sometimes it's somewhere in between. Doesn't matter where it sits on that spectrum. Living and breathing it is absolutely critical. So I become a consumer of my own problem. I become a consumer of my own product, not in just a way that I go in and look at an app or go onto a website or do something or do this. It's really about understanding it inside and out. But it doesn't just stop with your opinion, because if you're working from your opinion, you're working in a silo. It's about then using and leveraging all of the rest of the internal views that exist. It's about looking at what the market wants. It's about knowing your consumers inside and out, however you decide to approach that. It's about looking at the competition as well. I'm not saying copy the competition, that's really boring, but use the competition as inspiration. It's an accelerant, in my opinion. And we can take that and we can then say, okay, cool. So if we rewind to what I started with, we found a way to relate to our CEO, regardless of what type of CEO they are. We found a way to communicate them, because those kind of go hand in hand. If I know who I'm dealing with and who I'm working with, I know how to work and communicate with them. I'm carrying out their vision, and I want to come back to that point because it's another really important one, such that I have that background that I didn't have, because I've not been in the company for the 2, 3, 4, 5 years before I joined. And then I have the credibility such that I can come in, and this is coming back to that point I highlighted, such that I can come into the room and I've got data, and I've got my own usage experience, and I've got what sales are saying, and I've got what customer success is saying. But then on top of that, I'm able to tie that back into like tangible ways of solving and changing and pivoting and innovating. And that is genuinely where it comes. That's how the pushback can actually then happen. I'm not suggesting always saying yes to a CEO. That's a terrible suggestion. I would never say it, and I would never do it. But if the relationship is where it needs to be, and if the credibility is established, having that influence comes along with it. And I say that again, that's not from a textbook, that's not from reading a blog, that is my own experience. And I say it having messed it up, and I say it having done it successfully. And that ties into one final point. I'll stop talking I'll let you chime in, Doug. But one final point is this ties into commercial growth. This ties into revenue. This ties into why we're in business. I have no judgment or qualms on if you're not for profit, but if you're a business that is for profit, you must be thinking this way from a product leadership perspective. And that's my blueprint. It's not one size fits all. It's not one size fits every company, but it's a framework that's enabled me to have impact personally. And I've seen it work. You got to do it. You got to mess up, like, in order to self-reflect and find what does work and what doesn't work. So yeah, I'll pause there for a minute, Doug, if you wanted to chime in or reflect on anything.
No, do you know what's really interesting is, again, I sort of see lots of chat, and you'll have seen this on LinkedIn where people are sort of the different types of stakeholder, and I think you've got the rhino and the hippo and the whatever, and there's this almost this sort of this attitude of pay lip service to the CEO because they're making ego driven decisions, etc., which they may or may not do, but that doesn't actually help. That doesn't solve any problems. So. And owning the relationship and being responsible for the outcome of the relationship does solve the problems. And it's interesting you said that you got that wrong. When was the pivot point for you? When was the point when you just sort of thought, oh God, actually I might have been, in my own mind right then, but none of that helped. Okay, this is what I need to change in the way I deal with these people. When did you decide or realize that actually it's not about them, it's about me? It doesn't really matter what CEO they are. I own this.
One thing that I will clarify before I answer that question is I do agree that it's not about me, but I also don't agree that it's about them. I think it's about us. And I think that for me, like effective product leadership and the relationship with the CEO, it does become about us. Like, it's not just the two of us, but it's a joint thing, right? Like, whether a CEO comes from a product background or not, they're a CEO. They're not the CPO. They don't have the headspace and the time and the dedication. They have the dedication without a doubt. They don't have the time. They don't have the bandwidth to go in and serve that role. So they brought in a CPO or a VP product or a head of or whatever it may be to do that job. And I think it's really important. But to actually answer the question, it was about a decade ago. I'm not going to get into any of the specifics.
No need to mention names.
I lived an experience where I thought I was right, and I was probably not at an immature stage in my career, but I was in an earlier stage in my career. It was a decade ago. And I thought, well, my background, my CV is fantastic and my background is wonderful. And I know everything going into it. And it was probably, in hindsight, a fairly immature perspective. And I learned along the way of like, okay, well, hang on, that's not the case. This is a really complicated space that I'm in. And there's a lot of nuances that I don't know. And there's a lot of history that I'm not up to speed on. And I just didn't put the time into the CEO relationship. And I don't want to say that there were clashes, but that's probably like mild clashes were a good way of looking at it, of like personality type. I'm obviously quite extroverted and out there, as everyone who's attending has probably picked up on. And the CEO wasn't quite that. And there were clashes at that level, at my not like style flexing level, but then also on top of that, of then not necessarily getting into the brain of the founder of the company and really understanding it inside and out. And I'll be totally honest with you, I moved on. And it was good for me because I wanted to change sectors anyway. But it was then shortly after that, being in a seed stage company and living it in a new way. I didn't have those issues, by the way. And I started to reflect on it. And I was like, wait, Kevin, hang on. You aren't right with everything. Yeah, maybe you were right with some things. And it's not about being right. It's not about ego. But you could have done this differently. You could have done that differently. And like, I don't know if that's personal for me, but I think it is something that any product leader should be able to do, should be able to be self-critical and be like, yeah, even though things maybe wound me up and raise the blood pressure here and there, like it goes back to your point, Doug, which I do agree with. It's not only about me. It's also about the company, and it's also about the founder. So I had this kind of like personal growth moment, which was phenomenal. And I just continued to build on it. And I did experiment. It wasn't like I had one reflection and it was like, oh, it's all fixed and wonderful. Like, it was evolutionary and it was over time, but it was something that I then carried with me into future roles and wasn't perfect with, but have reached a really strong point with. with Hero, the company that Klarna bought, before I then sort of moved into a new world of a 4,000 person company. And I had to then adapt in that same way, which it was very much like for like. And one thing that I will say, like I've spoken to so many colleagues. There's a load of communities that I'm part of. CPO track, Nam Salma's group is one that I'm part of. And a lot of people are along the same journey, which is like that self-reflection and taking that time to go in and look at what, like, it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and get caught up in the chaos and the hype and everything else that's going on. But for me, that's like that slowing down and that reflecting is really where some of that introspective evolution, you know, however I want to buzzword it, sort of came from for me personally.
Yeah. So interestingly, so what about then you're owning the relationship and actually, you know, you're owning I like the way that you like to own all the problems of the product as well. And what about overcoming resistance then? What are your tips and strategies for that?
You're never going to avoid resistance. You're never going to be told yes every time you go in and push back. But you also don't want to be a yes person. So for me, in my view and how I practice is like, I know there's going to be a margin of pushback and resistance. And I also know that if I have a really strong hunch and it's backed by data and it's backed by everything it needs to, that I may also still be told no. That's just reality. Like the strategic view of a CEO, for example, is sometimes something that you do have to deal with based on the company that you're in, because you're not in that position and because there may be something that you're not thinking about and that you're not totally tuned into. But I would challenge the product leader in that scenario of like, what is it you don't understand? What is it that you've not actually wrapped your head around to understand why, for example, a CEO or a board member is saying, we must go do this thing and we don't agree with what you're saying. Now, I will say, and this is like slightly doom and gloom, if you are right as a product leader and you get that resistance or pushback, maybe it's not the right place for you to be. However, if you do have the right point and you are in the right place, there's sometimes trade-offs, but like critical sort of strategic decision-making that's met with reason, I would put that back on, are you in the role and in the right organization that you ought to be? And I say that also having lived it and having had asked myself those questions previously as well. And it's not always yes, by the way. It's not always, oh, I'm in the wrong role. It's always not always. It's sometimes I'm not thinking about something the right way, or I've not done this, or I've not dotted this I or crossed this T, for example.
Okay, so how would you sort of build that trust with the CEO?
So I think it goes back to how I sort of opened up my section or segment, which is like relationship's critical, right? Like I have to be somebody my CEO wants to work with. I also have to be somebody that understands company history, the big picture, the revenue goals, all of those things that are critical to company growth and are why we're in business. So that's number one. Number two is I need to be absolute expert and check the ego out of it as soon as I walk into the office or jump onto the Hangout or whatever it is that I'm doing when it comes to my day-to-day. It's not about me at this stage. It's about me representing the collective, the customer, the market, the competition, the internal stakeholders in the business. And if I'm doing that, I'm not traffic director. I am truly like parsing and making sense of everything that exists, such that I can go in and say, based on strategy and vision and based on data points XYZ, and based on me being a person who lives and breathes this problem, here's the direction that we should take. That for me is the recipe, and that works. It's worked for me multiple times in multiple companies.
So you've mentioned this understanding the history a couple of times. How important do you think that is?
Foundational. And if you don't, like, you will be at such a disadvantage. And again, I know I keep saying this, so sorry to sound like a broken record, but like I've not gotten into the history previously, and I found how that can be detrimental. And it's like, you don't need to spend weeks and months in research, but you need to find a way to leverage what happened before you joined. Yeah. Otherwise, you're going to repeat mistakes. Otherwise, you're going to not have the context that you need, and you're going to frustrate people, and you're not going to deliver. You're going to frustrate yourself, and everything that exists in between those sort of buckets. So yeah, that's my view on that.
No, I think it's good, particularly if you're dealing with a heritage business or a heritage brand, or
exactly
what may have a not-for-profit you've mentioned as well. So, Kevin, that's been amazing. So thank you very much for that. I think we're about to come to the end of it. So
nice. Thanks.
No, not at all. That's been amazing. Thank you. So I guess to summarise, everybody, thanks again. I think the takeaways for me here were from Lucy, it's time with leaders, spend time with leaders. That's how you'll influence them. And for the CPOs out there looking to become a CEO, that's how you'll understand the next steps. From Ankur, I think understanding the business goals was the real takeaway. What are the business goals and what does success look like? So you can link the product strategy to the business goals, success for the product, success for the business. And from Kevin, the thing I really took from that was just owning the relationship, you know, taking personal responsibility for relationship with the CEO. That's how you get it done. So again, thanks everybody. Thanks Laura for arranging this. And thank you all for attending.